Hello, everybody. Such a full room, fantastic. So my name's Jackie Fitzgerald. I'm the Executive Director at the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, and I'd really like to welcome you all very warmly today to the 8th Applied, what's our conference called? The Applied Research in Crime and Justice Conference, and really pleased to see such a full room. So first up, I'd like to hand to Uncle Alan Murray, who's going to acknowledge country for us today.
Yeah, good morning. How are you? Not enough coffee this morning? I just had my first coffee out there and it was not good. Good morning, how are you? And my name's Alan Murray. I'm also the chairperson of the Metropolitan Local Land Council. Within our boundaries, we have something like in the order of, I'm just trying to count, 25 clans that make up the Eora Nation. And then, like you're saying, we don't do, the chairperson doesn't do the acknowledgement of country, we do the welcome to country, to acknowledge all those First Nations clans who've been wiped off the earth because of dispossession of this country. And as you can see, Sydney is still expanding, still building roads, tunnelling underneath the Sydney Harbour, and then we're finding out there are more Aboriginal sites in the Sydney Harbour than what it was before. So I want to pay respects to, and I welcome you to Gadigal land. I want to pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And one of those things about walking on this great land called Gadigal is that you can observe and also understand the different dimensions and also the landscapes and the sites that you walk on every day. And you've come here, like me, I'm trying to wake up and get here and then finding that, yes, I recognise that. When Darling Harbour was a industrial place, and we unearthed a dugong here, and that was 3,000 years old. So we still finding out today then that there's always secrets about this land. But also want to acknowledge First Nations people in the room. I want to acknowledge Barangaroo, Padagaran, Pamoy and Mosquito. These are our legendary warriors who'd fought for this country, and still in their minds and their hearts that we still have a great understanding of their perception, what it was like during those first 10, 20 years of occupation. And it means a lot. And for myself and a group of men are going to England, to Oxford, to retrieve our elders and bring them back here to country to make it safe. So with that, I want to pay respects to yourselves and obviously having a quick look at your program. A lot of information there in terms of how you get better at dealing with First Nations people and getting it right. It means a lot. And I agree too. Like the Uluru Statement from the Heart, it mentioned about our children being locked up, and we're not an innate criminal society and race. It means a lot that we can unpack all the disadvantage, and it means a lot. So with that, have a great day. And there's one thing I need to say to you, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been in this country for 65,000 years, plus one day. I say plus one day because we're now nearing our milestone, and we certainly want a lot of yeses when it comes to the referendum. Don't hear the noise with the no. It means that we can unpack and get it right. So with that, I'll just put this question, how can a race of First Nation people not be mentioned in the Australian Constitution? And that's where it starts. It starts here, and it starts with the Constitution. So with that, have a great morning. I pay respects to the Gadigal elders, past, present, and emerging. Also, if you flew into Sydney Airport, you would have landed on Bidjigal land. These are the two clans that can trace their lineage before them tall ships came through Sydney Harbour. Myself, my mum comes from Walgett, she's a Gamera woman. My dad comes from Cumbergundy Mission, between Echuca and Shepparton, down there in Victoria. and he's a Yorta Wiradjuri by descent. So with that, have a great morning. I'm now looking forward to a better coffee. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Uncle Alan. And just like to acknowledge the generosity that Uncle Alan has expressed to us here today, and it always feels very real to me when we meet on this harbourside land, and we think about the legacy of colonisation for Aboriginal people. And we're going to hear a lot over the next couple of days about Aboriginal people, too many Aboriginal people in our courts and too many Aboriginal people in our prisons. And I guess I'm inviting everyone to think about the generosity that Uncle Alan has invited us here today, and think and reflect on that when we're trying to make improvements for the justice system for Aboriginal people and for Australia going forward. So I'd also like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians, and also acknowledge the elders past and present, and also acknowledge the large number of Aboriginal delegates that we've got here today, and really welcome their wisdom and contribution, and the cultural element that those wise people bring. Now I'd also just like to now welcome our distinguished guest, the Attorney-General of New South Wales, who's going to open proceedings for us today. So welcome, Mr. Michael Daly.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I hopped out of the cab out the front, and the cab driver spoke to me in Scottish, and I said, well, that's lovely. He said, that's what we would say if we were welcoming you in Glasgow. I said, it's probably warmer in Glasgow than it is this morning at the front in Sydney. Great to be here. Can I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. And thank you, Uncle Alan, for your welcome to country. The electorate that I represent, Maroubra, sits at the end of Anzac Parade on a peninsula down there. And there are still families living in La Perouse who saw the white sails come through the heads a couple of 100 years ago. There's a totally unbroken connection to the land and the great people, and it's a great community. Can I acknowledge and welcome two keynote speakers to the Applied Research in Crime and Justice Conference who've travelled quite some distance to be here today. Firstly, Associate Professor arent Chalfin from the University of Pennsylvania, and Professor Vicky Hovain, the University of Western Australia, which is sometimes almost as far for us. And of course, several other keynote speakers who've also travelled to be here, some further than others. Elena Campbell, RMIT Melbourne, Professor Jason Payne, Griffith University in Brisbane, Professor Julia Quilter, University of Wollongong, just down the hill, and Professor Luke McNamara, University of New South Wales, just outside of my electorate. I understand there are about 450 delegates here today, including Aboriginal policy specialists, academics, other policy experts and researchers, and some judicial officers. My old mate Peter Johnson, the Chief Judge of the local court, I just saw him sitting up the back there. There are delegates here from Crime Prevention, Women's Safety, the Law Enforcement and Conduct Commission, the Director of Public Prosecutions, Courts Administration, Corrections and Justice Health. I know you've come from near and far, from throughout Australia and New Zealand, and I welcome you all here, and I'm really pleased to be able to open your conference this morning. I'm about 5 months into my tenure as an Attorney General in a new government. Early days, but I have to say I'm benefiting greatly from the time I served as a minister in the last Labor government, and additionally having been the police minister, with so many themes and people that I'm dealing with are quite familiar. I have to say the cabinet that I'm working in now is the best team I've ever worked with in my life, certainly the best team I've worked with in almost 18 years in Parliament. There's no ego, no rivalry, no turf wars, no tension or ill will between key ministers, no war between the Minister for Police and the Attorney-General. And the agencies that benefit from your work benefit greatly, and they're determined to work with us to keep driving good public policy outcomes. The flow-on effect of this teamwork and comprehensive respect in our cabinet is just good old-fashioned, well-intentioned decision-making that's not stained by politics or any personal grievance. This is good for the public sector, particularly the public interest justice sector, because it means that the core business of closing the gap, reducing incarceration rates and embracing justice initiatives that are evidence-based and that really work is absolutely front and centre of our new cabinet. This government is enthusiastic about the great analytical minds that you've gifted us in the public service. You all have a broad range of experience, background and interest, and each one of you has a really valuable role to play in shaping our society in what's a difficult time. I suppose times are always difficult, but they just throw up different challenges at different times. So I'll just say to you what I tell my ministerial staff and what my departmental staff, and I can see some of them hiding there in the crowd. Morning, Matt. Push your ideas, push your interests, and challenge yourselves to think about how your passions can be translated into constructive policy outcomes that will help those around us. And my chief of staff hates this when I say this to people because he gets inundated, his inbox gets inundated, but my door is open. And now you've heard people say that before. Can I tell you, that is a absolutely 100% genuine offer. If you think you have something that you want to tell me that I could benefit from, my door is literally open. Come and see me, ring the office, come in, let's have a chat. I've found in my time as a minister, both last time and this time, that sitting down with experts like you, good, well-intentioned people, is more efficient than sitting down and reading briefs for hours and hours. And be proud of what you do. I've been in public life for almost 30 years, and I do it because it's the only place where you can make decisions that absolutely change people's lives and make the world a better place. And we could all probably be sitting in offices somewhere else in Sydney or around the world this morning making more money, but that's not why we do what we do. The common thread that runs through everyone in this room is a care for people and a care for the impact your work has on the community in which you live, and not just about your own well-being. That's what working in the public service and in driving public policy outcomes is all about. And I thank you for that, and I admire you for those decisions. Your work informs decisions that change people's lives, literally. In public life and in government, particularly when you're spending other people's money, it's crucial that you make wise and informed decisions. So we need the expert data, evidence, research and recommendations you provide to help inform decisions about where public investment should go so we can get the very best results. A key priority of this government is placing evidence-based decision-making at the core of all of our discussions. When conceiving and crafting policy with respect to criminal justice outcomes and systems, a strong evidence base is particularly crucial. It's important from a community safety perspective, it's important from a human rights perspective, and it's important in maintaining the rule of law and the integrity of government. In New South Wales, we're fortunate to have Boxar providing accurate data and analysis to inform policymakers and administrators in the criminal justice system for a very long time. My first involvement with Boxar came in 2009 when I was appointed as the Minister for Police, and Don Weatherburn was in charge, and Don was the first person I saw when I jumped out of the lift this morning. Where are you, Don? He's here somewhere. He's an icon, greatly respected. And it's the envy of other states, Boxar, it really is. But without this high quality reporting on both qualitative and quantitative data, our society would be very different to how it is today. So it's often said that you can't manage what you can't measure. That's why data-driven insights from Boxar's statisticians and researchers is crucial in developing and implementing strategies that help reduce crime and provide a more efficient, effective and equitable justice system. And I've had a look at the program you've got for this week. It's a fantastic example of the breadth of subject matter, the really interesting stuff that you all work with. Reducing violence in First Nations communities, First Nations youth justice, bail decisions for Aboriginal people, family and domestic violence, violence against women, drugs, alcohol and mental health, young people and mental health, youth crime, corrections, policing, bikies and motorcycle gangs, sexual violence, child sexual abuse material, technology and crime control. Such an incredible subject matter with great presenters. I wish I could stay to listen to some, but I've got a cabinet meeting this afternoon and I've got a bit of homework to do that my own department's prepared for me. And I can see that your focus is on issues of importance to the community, the public and therefore to government, that you're conducting rigorous investigations into what works in those areas and what needs to change. The real significance of this conference is not only that you get to showcase new, rigorous, relevant research across all areas of crime and criminal justice and human behaviour, but that you also make it available to government and decision makers. And I can tell you that all of the ministers who rely on your data are very grateful. We absolutely rely on your ability to communicate your findings to help inform policy direction and funding decisions. In fact, just last week I was briefed by Boxar on 2 reports about the experience of sexual assault complainants in the criminal justice system. One was released last week and the other you'll hear about today. And so I commend Professor Julia Quilter of the University of Wollongong and Professor Luke McNamara of UNSW, who are here today for their outstanding work in analysing 75 transcripts from sexual assault trials finalised in the District Court between 2014 and 2020 involving 302 charges. Painstaking work, tens of thousands of pages to go through. The work was covered on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald last Thursday. More has been said about it today. And the research released today by Elena Campbell from RMIT's Centre for Innovative Justice and Francis Lockie of KPMG is the result of interviews of complainants and other key informants, including police, about their experience from initial report right up to trial. And I see all 4 researchers are presenting a keynote session this afternoon that will unpack their findings and recommendations. Can I urge you all to attend that one? Reflecting on last week's briefing, I thought about how this work is a strong example of how researchers and policy experts use evidence gathered through interviews with people who share personal and often quite traumatic experiences, then translate them into useful data, findings and recommendations about ways we can all move forward. The level of care, professionalism and expertise that's required to discuss these matters respectfully and sensitively with those who have lived through this experience is not to be underestimated. I thank those who've worked on those projects for their outstanding work. What you've given us is solid evidence behind what complainants have told us, that victims of sexual assault often find the criminal justice system a long and difficult ordeal. Many have said that they feel like they're on trial. So you've given us a real call to action, once again, that creates a pathway for policy response. And what was evident from those studies is that while steps to improve the process have been made over time, there is still much more that we need to do to improve justice responses to sexual offences. The current process is challenging and in some cases brings fresh trauma for complainants. This is not where we wish to be, and we all need to work together to minimise the traumatic burden for complainants and to adapt the entire process to reflect community expectations. It's not easy, so we have to make small steps in that regard to get it right and still keep the balance of fairness in the justice system. But we can't stop just because it's hard. And the work started with these reports. It's continuing, and I'll be relying on your analysis to ensure our policy development takes the right direction to effectively and compassionately combat the systemic issues we face in that regard. So thank you all for your rigorous and in-depth work on issues that are critical to all of us, to me, to you, to the community, to the public and to this government, a government that's opening and listening. I urge you to persevere with examining issues that seem entrenched and intractable, but you can't get rid of entrenchment and intractable issues and problems unless you break them down brick by brick. Time and time again, through practical research, you've recommended real solutions, solutions that work. So thank you very much for the work you do and have a really good conference. Thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you so much, Attorney. Okay, now just indulge me a tiny bit about, I'm just going to give a little overview about what we're hoping for with this conference. So this is the 8th conference of this type. So this series was initiated by Icon, Don Weatherburn, about 10 years ago, criminology icon and my predecessor in the role at Boxer. And what we were trying to do here is really create a bridge between research and policy. So we wanted a few things out of this event. One, to showcase really high quality empirical research. Second, we wanted to focus on the issues that are of importance to the community and those that are important to government. So really focusing in on the highly relevant issues in our community today. We wanted it to be practical. And last of all, we wanted decision makers in the room to hear this evidence. So we wanted to really allow policymakers and those who are in authority and have the power to act to hear about this kind of what works literature. Along the way, Griffith Uni came to collaborate with us on this series, and we now have alternate conferences each year with those two institutions. And I'd just also like to pay my respect to Professor Anna Stewart, who was really instrumental in establishing that collaboration. And unfortunately, Anna has passed since the last conference, but she's remains an enduring legacy in that collaboration. So you be the judge of whether we've achieved what we aim to in this conference. But looking at the program, I think it really is a stellar representation of actually really practical and implementable policy relevant research. So last time we hosted this conference in the beginning of 2019, it seems like a world ago, we were really excited to get 290 enthusiastic delegates at that event. This year, however, has exceeded all expectations. I certainly didn't realise how many of us wanted to get out of our pyjamas to come to work. We've had to negotiate a larger room a few months ago with the venue, and I'm really proud to invite 450 delegates to the event here, and we've also got a long waiting list of people we just couldn't fit them in the room. So it feels like the time is right for this kind of conversation to resume. We're going to hear about lots of important issues that are relevant to the criminal justice system today. So as the Attorney said, we've got talks on Aboriginal overrepresentation, domestic sexual violence, policing effectiveness and efficiency, community safety. And if that's not exciting enough for you, we've also arranged a 10-goal penalty shootout between the Griffith staff and the Boxer staff at the end of tomorrow's. So we'll see how that goes. Just a tiny little bit of housekeeping. So after the events today, we've got drinks and canapes in the same area that we're going to have our meals and refreshments. So just outside near the registration desk. So that starts at 5:15 for an hour. So everyone's welcome to join us for that. It's under the banner of networking, but the other slightly tedious point is about where the other room is. So the other room, so we've got our keynote sessions and in our parallel sessions. The parallel sessions will be in the A series will be in this room, and the B series will be in a room that just follows to the south. You follow the window along down to as far as you can go. That's kind of probably a little bit worrisome for some people, but for the first breakout session, we're going to have people showing the way, so please don't feel that it's too big a burden to go to that second room. It's really just a short walk, but you just have to follow the building down to the south there, and hopefully it will become clear. So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce our distinguished first keynote speaker. We're very privileged that Arent Chalfin from the University of Pennsylvania has travelled across the globe to be with us today. Arent is a rising star in criminology and has amassed a slew of awards and publications. I think I counted 30 peer-reviewed journal articles, and a growing reputation. In addition to being Associate Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Arent is Research Fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a Senior Affiliate at the Niskanen Center and Research Affiliate at the University of Chicago Crime Lab. So Arent's written extensively on a range of topics, and his current focus is what he's going to talk about today on the costs and benefits of policing, the preference of police officers, place-based crime prevention, and the determinants of crime victimisation. In 2020, Arent was awarded the Outstanding Young Experimental Criminologist Award by the Academy of Experimental Criminology, so that's our kind of criminologist. And in 2021 was awarded the Best Early Career Paper by the journal, a prestigious journal of criminology and public policy. I could go on, but I'm just stealing time from Arent, so I'm going to pass the mic over, and can you please join me in welcoming Arent Chalfin to talk.
Thanks, that was a great introduction. So really, thank you everyone for being here. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It is an honor to be asked to give a talk like this, and I'm very excited to give this talk because it brings together really the last 15 years of my professional career and all the thinking I've been doing about policing and the work that I do myself, the work that colleagues of mine have done. And it was really a lot of fun to put this talk together. So I'm going to try to bring you a little bit around the world in giving this talk, but some of this will be disproportionately US focused. And there's a pragmatic reason for this. So I think Australia has maybe, 20 or 25 law enforcement agencies, the UK maybe 50. The US has 18,000 law enforcement agencies, which is insane, completely chaotic, but it's great if you're a researcher because, that's where all the variation comes from that we can exploit, right? So, that's one of the reasons why a lot of these policing papers that look across cities, have been from the US, but I will try to touch down in various parts of the world throughout my talk today. All right, let's see if this is gonna work. Beautiful. All right. So the game plan for today, there's three parts to the talk. And by the way, if I start taking too long, if I'm running out of time, just let me know and I'll wrap it up. I'll shut up quickly. Okay, so the first thing I want to cover is what do we know about the impact of the investments that we make in policing, right? There's many different ways that we could spend our public dollars on public safety. Policing is one of them. So is that something that at the margin is working? What do we know about that? And then second, understanding that policing is going to have potentially benefits, but also potentially large costs. Does research tell us something about how we might maximize those benefits and minimize those costs? Which I think is a question we've been thinking a lot about in the US, and I know that people here are thinking about the same sorts of questions. And then finally, I'm going to save time at the end to tell a story about a city that was forced to completely change the way that it did policing and had this really interesting thing happen with respect to crime. And I want to tell you that story. Okay, I want to start with a little bit of context about how much industrialized countries tend to spend on police. Someone here, I'm sure, knows exactly what this number is for Australia. I'm sure someone's got like a really, really precise estimate. Best I can tell, it's something like $14 billion that is spent on law enforcement, on policing in Australia. It's maybe around $560 per capita. In the US, we spend $215 billion on the police, $650 per capita. When you make the GDP adjustments and the purchasing power parity adjustments, it actually ends up working out to about the exact same number as a share of GDP. Here's what this looks like. I hope everyone can sort of see this across most of the OECD. So these are most of the wealthy industrialized countries in the world. For some reason, Australia is not represented in this periodical. I'm not sure why. but I highlighted the US in blue, and Australia is right next to the US, if you were to plot Australia here. And this is the share of GDP spent on policing. And there's some variation here. So down at the bottom, you have Finland and Luxembourg spend maybe 0.5% of GDP on policing. At the top, you have countries like Hungary and Greece that spend a little over 1.25%. But it's kind of remarkable that you have all of these different countries with different levels of crime, different traditions, different histories, and they all kind of land around the same place. I think it would be not unreasonable to say, yeah, most industrial countries, they're right around 1% of their GDP that they spend on policing. So I think that's kind of interesting to see how much uniformity there is, even if there's still also some interesting variation to consider. Okay, so that's what we spend. Do police, in fact, reduce crime? At the margin, right? This isn't really asking the sort of facile question of like, what if we had no police? But when we invest that additional dollar in police, do we get something back? And if we don't, there's other things we could be doing with that money. But if we do get something back, I think that's important to know. And I want to start with why police might not reduce crime. And then I'll build out from there. And I'm taking these are just news headlines that I probably could have picked one from thousands, right? There's so many articles like this. So the first idea is that a lot of what police do is not crime fighting, right? Police deal with a lot of caretaking issues. Police are kind of the residual claimants for every social problem that some other agency isn't able to solve. So there's a serious traffic crash, the police are dealing with that. A noise complaint, a call for service involving someone having a mental health crisis, a cat stuck up in a tree, right? And so if the police are doing all of these things with their time, some people might say, well, how is it that they're able to reduce crime also, right? Just a lot of their time is spent on other matters. This headline is wrong. Police solve well more than 2% of all major crimes in every country I've yet seen data for. So I'm not sure where the number comes from, but it is right that most major crimes aren't solved, aren't cleared by an arrest, right? It's hard to clear a lot of crimes. I'm robbed in the street. It's some guy wearing a blue blazer, right? I didn't get a good look at him. It's hard to know how to solve a lot of these crimes. And so some people would say, well, the police are not solving most crimes. And again, how is it that police are really going to reduce crime in a major way? We can think some other reasons as well. A lot of crimes are impulsive, right? So how would police be able to deter a crime that's completely impulsive, right? Or we might think of crimes like domestic violence that are largely occurring indoors, where the police are not able to actively patrol. So how are police supposed to deal with that? And it is a really hard problem, right, for the police to deal with. And then, we can just think about all of the sort of deeper root causes of crime and violence that everyone in this room spends a lot of time thinking about. And the police are not intended, right, to be something that addresses the root causes. The police are dealing with the symptoms, right? And so that's another reason why people say sometimes, well, the police might not be where we want to spend our marginal crime dollar. So here's a news article I pulled up from the Sydney Morning Herald, but I probably could have found something like this in any major newspaper around the world. I'll just read the quote. So generally, the number of police officers in Australia has risen as the amount of crime has declined, but criminologists say the two aren't linked. And this is, I think, still a reasonably predominant view about policing. The idea being that, crime is a sociological phenomenon, and the police are really just able to respond to crime, but not change it in a marked way. And this is, a feeling that I think I see come up a lot. There's another quote that I pull from this news article that I think is very important, and I want to speak to a little bit, in sharing some empirical evidence in this. So counterintuitively, more police on the beat means more crimes get discovered, but people who have turned straight can be criminalized for minor offenses and inducted through prison into a life of serious crime. So this is the idea of net widening, right? That if you have a lot of police, they're going to do something. They might make arrests for minor crimes, someone ends up in jail, they lose their job, their life becomes worse in some way, and then maybe they're more likely to end up committing crime, right? That's a very reasonable story, And surely that happens a lot in Australia, in the US, and everywhere else. So I want to make sure I speak to that a little bit. Here's a paper from 1983. This was a paper that I think really represented the predominant view among academic researchers in 1983. The title is very descriptive, right? The effect of police employment on crime. And here is the finding from that paper. We find no evidence in our data that police employment reduces violent or property crime. So this was written in 1983, well, it was published in 1983, it probably was written in 1981, right? We know how long it takes to get anything published. And Broken Windows Policing comes out in 1982, written by George Kelling and James Q. Wilson, and they really challenged this idea. And there's been a large academic literature that's proliferated and developed and gotten better and better ever since this paper's written. And that's the literature that I want to share with you today. So first, I just want to acknowledge that this is, the effect of police on crime it's not a very easy question to answer. This is my favorite correlation versus causation cartoon, right? We have a couple of penguins, I guess, in Antarctica, saying, do you think all these film crews brought on global warming, or do you think that global warming actually brought on the film crews, right? And you can imagine that's like a very reasonable set of questions, right? You're not really sure. You just see two things going on at the same time. You don't really know which way the causation runs. The same thing is true of police and crime, right? I might observe that places that have more police also have more crime, but if government is doing something reasonable, that is what you will see, right? Because you're going to want to put more police where there is more crime. And so we need a way to break apart correlation and causation. And that's really what the project of applied social science research has been in this area over the last 20, 30, 40 years. Okay, so let's sort of dive in. So broadly speaking, the strategy here is to try to find something that shifts police, that shifts the number of police officers at the city level, but which isn't directly tied to crime. So something that's just kind of moving the level of police employment around, but for arbitrary reasons, right? Just trying to find kind of a natural experiment in the real world. There's a number of these natural experiments. I'll share one that's from the US that's led to a lot of the recent literature. So in 1994, the US Congress passes a major crime bill. And one of the big things in that crime bill is that the federal government starts awarding block grants to US cities that they can use to hire police. Why was this part of the crime bill? Well, for 30 straight years in the United States, crime went up year after year after year, basically. And this was the thinking, that this would be the response. This was had broad bipartisan support at the time in the United States. And you might say, well, you told me that there was going to be something kind of random that shifts police employment, but surely it can't be random which cities are getting these grants. And if these grants were being distributed in a way that was sensible, I would agree with you. But it turns out, right, there's all these different political considerations into who gets grants, right? And a lot of it's like, well, we have to make sure that every state is represented, and politicians fight for their particular cities to get more of this grant funding. And when all is said and done, when you actually look at the relationship between grant funding and crime, there is no relationship between grant funding and crime. And so you can just sort of see, well, when a city happens to get awarded a grant for reasons that no one can really tell, like why that happened in that given year, you can then just see, well, more cops were hired, the size of the city's police force grew, what happened to crime? And when we do that, here's kind of the broad consensus, at least for the United States. So on average, if you have 10% more police, we think you probably are going to see a 6% reduction in homicide, about a 4% reduction in overall crime, and there tends to be a bigger effect on violent crimes than property crimes, which is a finding that is found throughout the literature in a lot of different contexts, which is interesting. Another way to think about these numbers is that, and again, this is for the US, where homicides are a lot more common than they are in Australia. For every 10, let's say for every 15 police officers that are hired, we had a range in the research from like 10 to 17. I'll just sort of take the midpoint. For every 15 police officers that you hire, those police officers save about one life in the form of an abated homicide per year. This is holding constant other spending. So this is sort of saying, there's some city budget, you can spend it on cops, you could spend it on firefighters, you could spend it on any other thing that a city would spend money on. In the past, if we spent that money on police, this is what we would get back in terms of a 10% change in police employment. I do want to flag something here that I think gets lost a lot when I see popular media coverage of papers like this, and this is from one of my papers. There's been a lot of thinking, well, what if we reallocated spending away from the police and towards social services? What would happen? When I've talked to journalists, I always say, well, I have no earthly idea because I've never seen that done at scale anywhere. So I would only be guessing, and I would have no better idea than you would, right? So this research is backward looking, right? It says in the past, over the last 40, 50 years, when we spend more on police and less on other things, there does seem to be a trade-off with respect to public safety. And this is in opposition, right, to some of that early literature that said there's no impact of police on crime. But who knows what the future will bring, right? Maybe we know better how to do this than we did in the past. I don't know. But I think what I would say is this research might make us all just a little bit cautious in thinking about making major changes to the way we do public safety. If we think about who the victims of crime are, right, they tend to be the poorest, the most disadvantaged people. That's true everywhere. And so the people who might benefit from less policing are the same people who bear the risks if we get this wrong. And I think that just makes this a very hard policy area to work in. Okay, so what about enforcement? When you have a larger police force, does the net of the criminal justice system widen? I've got two findings here. One is entirely obvious, I think, and the other one I think is actually kind of counterintuitive. So here's the one that I think is fairly obvious. When you have more police, you do get more arrests for low-level crimes, things like liquor law violations, disorderly conduct, drug possession, things like that. Bigger police forces do widen the net of the justice system. Here's the finding that might be a little bit more counterintuitive. More police, and again, this is from the US, more police actually have meant fewer arrests for the kinds of serious crime that result in a prison sentence. Things like serious assaults or robberies, things like that. Why might that be? Well, if the police reduce crime, there are fewer arrests that need to be made. And even if you take a US city that's got way, way more crime than Sydney, a typical police officer might make 20 arrests in a year, and those 20 arrests might lead to 2 people serving time in a prison in the United States. So if you're reducing crime through police hiring, it's not hard actually to see how you could also reduce serious arrests. So when you bring this work together, what you sort of say is, well, if the way the police are trained to do policing is to make arrests when they see something that is an arrestable offense, yeah, you can get more arrests, you can get more people in jail, you can get more people into the justice system, and that tends not to work well for people. But it doesn't necessarily act as a driver of mass incarceration. And so when you think about the United States and just the enormous volume of people who are incarcerated in the United States, I do not think that police hiring has been a driver of that. If anything, I think it's had a mitigating impact. The driver has instead been just a decision being made to incarcerate people instead of divert them when they end up in the justice system. Okay, so that's sort of the 50,000-foot view at the city level, but we all know that crime is a very local phenomenon, right? It's at the community level, even just a couple of blocks often, right, that matter for crime. And so I want to zero in a little bit and think about what happens to crime when there's more versus less police presence. And again, the strategy is going to be very much the same. You want to find something that's shifting police presence but isn't directly shifting crime, so that the police are kind of moved around for reasons that are fairly random. And here's a couple of ideas that have been leveraged, some really creative ideas, but you can also think about the limitations of each of these ways of figuring this out. So let me just go through these in turn. So I'll start with the London tube bombings of 7/7/2005. Obviously a terrible, terrible event, scares everyone, right? In addition to the tragedy of that day, it scares people and they worry that maybe there's going to be more terrorism. So what do the police in London do? They flood central London with more police presence, right? So roughly these lighter blue colored areas, this is the map of Greater London. These areas get a lot more police after 7/7 in the 2 months following. The green areas don't get less police, they get sort of the same policing that they were getting. The additional police is coming from overtime. So here is an event study figure where you can just sort of see what happens to the level of policing. This is the number of police man-hours in central London relative to the rest of London in the 2 months after 7/7. So there's this big jump up. And here's what happens to crime. Crime goes down. And if you just sort of map some magnitudes onto this, police manpower went up by 30% in central London relative to the rest of London. Crime went down by 10% in that area. So actually, this is a very, very similar estimate to the estimate from the United States looking across cities that, this is sort of, you're getting something modest back, right? This isn't a ton difference for 30% more police manpower, but it's something. Here's another neat natural experiment. The author of this paper is Renee Jabri, who's actually just about to become a professor of economics at the University of Sydney. So if you ever want to learn more about this paper, she won't be far away. This is a really, really clever paper that I saw her present last year. So this is from a city in the US that she's not able to name. So this city, like many cities, uses an algorithm to identify crime hotspots. And so the police are allocated in greater numbers to the place that the algorithm thinks is a crime hotspot, and there's fewer police at the other potential crime hotspots. So this company that was creating the algorithm at some point decided to, just kind of juke it a little bit, right? They're always trying to make the algorithm better. So they juke the algorithm, and now the police are, instead of going to place A, they're going to place B. But Renee is able to observe not only where the police went, but where the police would have gone had the algorithm not been changed. And so now you can just sort of see, well, what happened to crime in those areas that would have received those extra patrols compared to the areas that actually got the extra patrols. And she finds something very similar to this city-level literature, that when you have more police in an area, crime goes down, but the police make more arrests for low-level stuff that widens the net of the justice system. Here's a third paper, just to give you a flavor for this literature. And this is one I really like because it's so natural. It really uses some very natural variation. Like terrorism is kind of, thankfully a reasonably rare thing. So one of the things that police officers do, right, is they respond to serious traffic accidents. So when an accident that's sufficiently serious pulls a cop away from his or her beat, research in Dallas, Texas was able to say, well, what happened to crime in that beat where that police officer would have been? And they find that about a 10% decrease in police patrol, because those police officers are being reallocated, led to a 4% increase in crime. So even in the 2 or 3 hours, perhaps, that the officer's gone, there is this response to crime, even in this extreme short-run kind of way. There's also randomized experiments. This is an area in criminology where there's just been an incredible investment in running randomized controlled trials. Researchers working with police departments to kind of randomize which hotspots get more patrols. Let me just go back if I can. Nope, I don't think I can go back. Well, if we can't go back, we'll just go forward. What I was going to say is, if you look across that literature, what you find is that not every study finds that more police presence impacts crime. Some show no effect at all, and many of these studies are kind of underpowered, so it's hard to know what to make of them. But about 75% of the studies do find an impact on crime when you have more police presence. And these are from cities around the world, the US, the UK, India, Colombia, a number of other places. Okay, so, I've sort of covered, what happens to crime when you have more police around. I think that's an important thing to know, but it's also a little bit unsatisfying, right? Because you probably are thinking, well, does it matter what the police do at hotspots? And let me just give you a kind of sneak preview of something I want to cover in a little bit more detail in a second by going to India. So this is there's a city in India. It's just escaping me which city this is at the moment. I don't know why, but it is. But this city was dealing with a problem of sexual assault happening in public places near the train station. So this kind of ran the gamut from sexual harassment, things that might not technically be illegal, to stuff that was very, very serious. And so the municipality tried to figure out what they could do, and they said, well, let's have more police patrol in this area. And police worked with some researchers, including Sophia Morale and a couple of other folks from the World Bank, to study what happened when these police patrols were allocated. And the really neat thing they're able to do is they said, well, half the time there's going to be 2 uniformed officers that are going to be doing the rounds, looking out for problematic behaviors. And the other half of the time, they're going to be undercover police officers. And here's what they find. They found that the uniformed patrols reduced sexual harassment and sexual assault, in fact, serious cases of these things, by about 1/3, which is an amazing finding, right? That's a big effect. The undercover patrols had no effect at all. And I think there's an important lesson here potentially, right, if we can extrapolate from this one example. And the lesson here is that the police didn't need to really make a lot of arrests necessarily. In fact, these police officers made very few arrests during the course of the trial, but the visibility of the police was the key, right? Just knowing that there's a police officer around was enough to deter some of these very troubling behaviors. And I think there's a lesson here potentially that can apply to a lot of other cities as well. I'm going to speak to some of this research. Okay. All right, so police manpower, police presence. Let's talk a little bit about police strategy. So I'm going to make an incredibly simplifying assumption here that there's 2 kinds of policing. There are going to be 2 extremes. Obviously, very few cities are going to meet either of those extreme definitions. They're going to be somewhere in the middle. But I think it's illustrative and not crazy to go down this route, so here I go. So one style of policing I'll call mass enforcement. And mass enforcement is going to be leveraging this kind of broken windows idea of saying, well, if you deal with the small things today, you can avert the big things tomorrow. Or alternatively, the inverse, right? If you fail to deal with the small things today, you're going to have more serious crime tomorrow. So the idea here is to make police officers more proactive, right? Get them out in the street, making stops, making arrests, right? Letting people know they're out there. And over time, the really big stuff is going to go down, right? That's the idea of this mass enforcement policing regime. The other regime that I'll reference, I'll call precision policing. So this is going to be the idea that you want to focus resources on the so-called power few, right? You know there's a small number of people in every community that drive a lot of the social costs of crime. Find a way to get those people off the street, find a way to deter them, whatever it takes, right? So those are kind of 2 broad approaches that can be used. So let me start with mass enforcement. What do we know about mass enforcement? And we don't have ideal natural experiments here because, this stuff really often changes in the short run, not the long run. But let me just sort of tell you what we've got, and you can see what you think. So first, we can consider something like a police slowdown. So sometimes for political reasons or union negotiation reasons or something like that, the police will just slow down what they're doing. Let the political leadership know they're not happy. This happened in New York City for 6 weeks at the end of 2014 and early 2015. The police, I think, just didn't feel very supported by New York City's mayor at the time, who made some comments about police officers in the US. And for about 6 weeks, NYPD makes 50% fewer stops and 50% fewer arrests, which is kind of remarkable. Like, it happens all of a sudden, and then 6 weeks later, they go back to what they were doing. And the question is, what happens to crime? So the key here is that some neighborhoods were affected far more by the slowdown than others because it was kind of informally organized. It wasn't like police leadership said, stop making arrests. This was kind of organized on websites and in private group chats, things like this. So some communities received maybe a 90% reduction in stops, and others more like a 10 or 15% reduction in stops. So what happened to crime? It turns out that the neighborhoods that saw the big reductions and the neighborhoods that saw the small reductions had about the same levels of crime during these 6 weeks. And in fact, crime during these 6 weeks in New York went down by a little bit. It didn't go up. So this is just one potential window into the importance of kind of a high stop or high arrest regime. Here's another kind of interesting natural experiment. This is also from New York City. So area commanders change over from time to time, right? You can think of a police district or a police precinct gets a new commander. Different commanders have different tastes for different styles of policing. So some commanders want a lot of stops, a lot of arrests. Other commanders are not incentivizing that in the same way. And so they're bringing these different approaches. So what happens to crime when proactivity changes because there's a changeover in police leadership? It turns out nothing happens to major crimes when this happens. So you can actually get fairly big variations in the number of stops and the number of low-level arrests, but we don't see that this bleeds over into changes in major crimes when there's a change in leadership. Here's another kind of clever natural experiment. So some colleagues of mine at UCLA noticed that in the aftermath of a killing, not by, but of a police officer in the United States, there's a decline, at least for around 2 months, in the number of stops that officers in that city make and the number of arrests that they make. You can tell a lot of stories about why this might happen. I think probably all those stories are going to be part of this. But then, you might want to know, what effect does this have on crime? Surely people might notice the police are not getting out of their cars as much. And again, we don't really see any impact on major crimes. And this is a very well-powered study because it looks at many, many US cities. So we can rule out even kind of a modest change in crime. Now, these are all maybe going to be kind of short-run, maybe somewhat subtle shifts. So I also want to talk about something else that I think is important to think about when we think about police proactivity. And that's the aftermath of a viral incident. So police officers are caught on film, right? Beating up a suspect, killing a suspect, something that outrages the community. What happens to crime in the aftermath of one of these viral events? So there's a paper that looks at this. Again, this is going to be the US context. And so these are two figures. One is homicides. The other figure is total crimes. The red line is when the viral event happens. That's actually, in this case, paired with an investigation. And you can see enormous, enormous changes in homicide and total crime. And I think it's important to think about these two literatures together. On the one hand, when police proactivity changes, for some kind of more natural reason, we don't see a big change in major crimes. But when you have this event that pulls the police away from the community, and also maybe the community away from the police, that can be the perfect storm that creates some very bad outcomes for people. And so, it probably is the case that the marginal street stop made by a police officer doesn't have a ton of public safety value. But some of these stops have enormous public safety value. And if the police are not making those stops, people could end up losing their lives. So, I think there's some subtlety here. So overall, the consensus here is that police presence matters. Being in a high arrest regime or a high stop regime, there's not a lot of evidence that matters for maintaining public safety. Okay, so I'm not sure how much time I have, but in my remaining time?
We have another 10 minutes.
Okay, I can do this in 10 minutes. Okay. In my remaining time, I'm going to tell a story about a city that was forced to completely change the way it did policing, and something actually very positive came of that. And this is New York City. This is the place where I was born and raised, so I lived through some of this stuff, and I've talked to a lot of the people who were involved in this stuff, in addition to writing a paper using quantitative data. So if you do have questions about this, I'm happy to weigh in. So here's a picture of the New York City subway. It's actually like a promotional photo. You can see it's like very clean, very empty. You have the pride flags advertising the Pride Parade. Looks like a great place to be. If you are going to visit New York, or you have, this is maybe a little bit more realistic, what you might expect to actually see. Maybe a little bit less bad post-pandemic, but maybe like remove one of those people, and that's what you get. But this is what the subways looked like in the 1980s in New York. Would anyone feel safe sitting in that subway car? If you do, kudos. I wouldn't feel safe there. And it's now kind of widely known that in the 1990s, crime fell all over the industrialized world, but New York kind of had this special miracle where, New York had 2,200 murders, more than 2,200 murders in 1990, and by the end of the decade, homicides had gone down by over 70%. So that I think is fairly well appreciated everywhere where people study crime. What is not as well known, and yet I think is actually more impressive, is that in the decade prior to the pandemic, homicides went down by another 50% in New York. And 2010 had been a banner year. It had been a record-setting year. Homicide in New York in 2010 was as low as it had been any year since the mid-1960s. And yet, in the next 9 years, or 10 years, there's this, another additional decline. And this is a time when homicides were flat or even rising in the United States overall. So this is kind of more impressive than the 1990s, where homicides were falling everywhere for reasons that, I don't know, we still don't fully understand, but something was in the water, right? So here's just a figure representing this. Murders are down 50%, shootings are down 50%. It's really remarkable. And here's where New York lands in 2019. So you can see some of the higher crime cities in the United States, Baltimore and Detroit here, Chicago, and then I've also put some Western European capitals up here in addition to Sydney. And you can see that New York looks a lot more like Amsterdam or London or even Sydney than it does Chicago or Detroit or Baltimore. And that's despite the fact that New York is still awash in illegal guns and has lots of poverty and social isolation and racism and like every bad thing you can think of is still in New York, right, at this time. So what caused this, right? It's a funny thing as a social scientist, right? We often say, well, we have some stimulus that we're studying, we want to know what the effects of that cause are. It's a little bit harder to know the causes of effects. So if you'll indulge me a little bit, I want to kind of engage in some research-oriented speculation. Okay, so is it gentrification? It's not gentrification. So homicide is going down everywhere in New York City during this time. If anything, the most disadvantaged places that have yet to gentrify are leading the pack in crime reduction. Is it more police? It's not more police. The police force size is identical in 2019 compared to what it was in 2010, virtually identical. Poverty rates didn't change. In fact, I think the New York City poverty rate was actually slightly higher in 2019 compared to 2010. But here's what happened. There was a giant change in the policy regime with respect to policing. This is a picture of a gentleman named David Floyd. David Floyd sued New York City. He was just outside his apartment and he was arrested by the police for attempted burglary of his own apartment. Clearly the police erred in this case, but he was joined by other litigants. And those litigants brought a case in federal court and said, there's a pattern here of unconstitutional policing by the New York City Police Department where they're engaging in stops that are not constitutional, and there's a racial pattern to this, where people who are black or Hispanic are being targeted more than people who are white, let's say. So this case makes its way through the federal courts, and it takes years, as it often does. But in 2011, the judge who was in charge of the case ruled that there's going to be this class action lawsuit. And in her ruling, she made it clear to everyone who was watching, I'm going to rule against New York City, right? That's going to come in a few years. It's not coming right now. But I'm telling you right now, there's a very strong case here, and something's going to have to change. And almost immediately, it did. So here is a figure that plots the number of stops made by NYPD officers annually, starting in 2005 and going out to maybe 2018. These are in hundreds of thousands of stops. So the NYPD actually is making about 750,000 stops at one point in 2011. And this goes down by an order of magnitude. It goes down officially by 97%. Unofficially, it's probably down by maybe 93% because there are some police officers who are just not documenting what they're doing. But it goes down by it's incredible. It's an order of magnitude. And at the time, the reaction here was that this was going to be very bad for public safety. This is a quote from then Mayor Michael Bloomberg. This is dangerous. It's a dangerous decision made by a judge that I think doesn't understand how policing works. But we know what happened, right? We know that homicides went down by 50%. And the question is, what replaced mass enforcement? What did the police do instead, right? Because I don't think this happened by magic, right? There was something the police did differently. And what they did is they replaced the mass enforcement regime with a precision regime. They doubled the size of the city's anti-gang units. They reintroduced a gang database, which had been defunct for many years, and they added a lot of names to it. And they started engaging in what are commonly in New York called gang takedowns. And a gang takedown is not really a technical term, but I think you can kind of guess what this is. Basically, you have these gangs and groups that are the drivers of a lot of the homicides and a lot of the shootings. Some of this stuff is just interpersonal beefs, right? It's like you insult me, I insult you on social media, and now we're out there trying to kill each other. Some of this stuff could be drug dealing, right? There's lots of different sources of violence among these gangs and groups. But the idea here was to proactively target the groups that were causing the most violence. Police and prosecutors worked together to build a case not against individual members who did the shootings, but also against co-conspirators. So if we're all in a gang and I shoot someone, but we're all part of this process of planning, we're going to be kind of collectively indicted and charged with conspiracy, okay? So it's a little bit like what the federal government of the United States did to take down the mafia, many years before. And so, this is not exactly a precision prosecution regime, but it's definitely a precision policing regime, especially when you consider what came before it. And just as those police stops are going down, these gang takedowns are ramping up. Right, so it's really this one-to-one replacement of this mass enforcement regime for this much more precise approach. And here's what happened. This is from a paper of mine. The communities that got a gang takedown for an 18-month period experienced a 1/3 reduction in the number of shootings, and actually, it's a little bit less precisely estimated, but over a 50% reduction in homicides, which is incredible because this has been a really sticky problem in communities where even with the large crime reduction that happened in the 90s, this had not gone away. So importantly, this wasn't like the police went down into these communities and then for 18 months they were there stopping everyone and arresting everyone. If anything, stops and arrests went down, not up, over these 18 months. So it's really this one fell swoop, you arrest a bunch of people, and then you're actually, if anything, a little bit more hands-off. So when we put this all together, looks a lot dirtier from the street level, but it's lovely from many feet above. But when you put this all together, here's the amazing story that I think can be told about New York that I hope will inspire people from around the world who think a lot about policing. So New York City saw murders go down by 50%. The jail population went down by 45%. Poverty didn't change. And so you really had this amazing thing where none of the root causes of violence were addressed because they're hard to address. It's a generational challenge, not the challenge for even a decade, I think. But policymakers were able to really make a big impact by just kind of switching the way that they focused on crime as a problem. Here's another figure that I think is inspiring, at least to me. So these are homicide rates in the 3 largest cities in the US, New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago, going back actually to the late 19th century, which is kind of interesting to see. I'll want to draw your attention to around 1990. In 1990, these 3 cities all had homicide rates that were virtually identical, around 30 per 100,000, so that's about a little over 30 times what Sydney's current homicide rate is, which is remarkable to think about. But you can see Chicago kind of, has this benefit in the 1990s that every city experiences, or many cities experience around the world. But then things are almost as bad now in Chicago as they were at the peak in 1990. New York and LA have had this completely different experience. Poverty rates have not changed in these cities. In fact, the poverty rate in New York and the poverty rate in Chicago are virtually identical, but the crime levels are not. And I think this speaks to the role that policy can play, even if it is hard to address root causes like structural racism and poverty and social isolation and all this bad stuff, right, that we haven't figured out a way to move forward with. And in a sense, there's nothing new here when we think about going after the small number of people who drive a lot of the violence. This is a picture of Al Capone, the infamous Chicago gangster. This is the U.S. homicide rate over, over 115-year period. This is when Al Capone is arrested and imprisoned for tax evasion. That's how they got him, tax evasion. It's also around the time when prohibition in the U.S. is repealed, so the source of revenue for a lot of these gangs goes away. And you can see, despite the fact that this is the Great Depression and a quarter of people are unemployed, you see homicide rates plummet. This is Pablo Escobar. Here is the homicide rate in Medellin in Colombia. Here's when Colombia security forces kill Pablo Escobar. And you can see that there's this big dip in homicide. Now, this is obviously not careful causal research here, right? This is just, a time series, right? But I think there's a lot of evidence, just from looking at time series, but also from the more careful causal papers, that if you can either incapacitate or deter the major players, you can make a big impact. You can see this in things like focused deterrence, where gang leaders are called into a room, kind of told, your law enforcement's watching you, right? And we're gonna really crack down if you use violence, but we're also gonna offer social services to people. Those kinds of evaluations tend to find positive impacts. And so, I think there's a lot of reasons, right, to sort of suspect that if police departments shifted in some way from more of a mass enforcement regime towards a precision policing regime, I think great benefits could be had. Now, the last thing I'll say is just that it's easier said than done, obviously. The expertise it takes to build these kind of major cases, like these gang takedowns, is considerable. You really need police and prosecutors to be able to work together, and you need people who are experienced and understand how to build these cases. It's not something that I think is learned overnight. Also, it's just hard, I think, in general, because police, if all the police did was crack down on people who were doing the shootings or doing the really serious crimes, we would all be very happy in this room because we know that drives a lot of the social costs of crime. But I think a lot of citizens would not be so happy because they would say, well, my car was broken into, I called the police, and they didn't come for 15 hours, right? Like, where were they, right? So I think it's hard to reallocate resources in this way, but that's why I'm just a researcher and not someone who has to actually make these decisions. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Yeah, we've got time for some questions, so invite people from the floor. Richard? We have a microphone coming. And maybe you could just introduce yourself.
A really terrific paper, thank you. I was just thinking about the correlation between crime rates and police numbers. And of course, most of the research is on a restricted range. You don't get a full correlation from zero. And I'm wondering, is the relationship sort of curvilinear? Is there a sweet spot, a point of diminished returns? And can we determine what that is?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I tried to answer this in one of my papers, and it turns out it's just, even with as many police agencies as we had, we're a little bit underpowered to detect the shape of that relationship, like, where would the inflection point be? There's certainly heterogeneity. So if you look at cities of different types, whether it's cities ranked by poverty rates or the share of people who are black, at least in the US context, or region, you do see heterogeneity. I think that suggests that there probably is some inflection rate. It's just kind of hard to know where that is at the moment. And the thing that's tough about this, right, and the thing that makes this such a good question is that, we're kind of, policymakers have begun to grapple with calls to really defund the police in a big way. Like, what if we spent 25% less on the police and 25% more, or I guess given the base rates, 75% more on social services? What would happen? And because we don't know what that inflection point looks like, it's very hard for a researcher to weigh in, right? I think what I would say is if a city does that, like, I'll be first in line to try to, write this up and see what happened. But it ends up being a very hard question to answer.
Oh, sorry, someone's running with a microphone. Come on, Francie.
Is there any evidence about applying this precision method to domestic and family violence?
Interesting. So David Kennedy, who's at John Jay College in New York, and has been responsible for thinking through the broader idea of focused deterrence. He has done something with this down in a city called High Point, North Carolina. I don't think it was ever written up as a research paper, but there's a popular news article about it. And the claim made in the news article is that when people were called in who were known batterers and kind of told, like, we've got our eyes on you, the next time you show up in court, like, we're gonna try our best to put you in prison. They had community meetings where people would offer services to people, people who were targets. So there's just an anecdote there, but I don't know anything systematic that's been done. It would be very interesting to see what this looks like. And one thing that I've seen looking at some US data at least is that people who are DV offenders often have a lot of other criminal history, and it's not like totally uncommon that they're in gangs and groups. So there could be some overlap in these populations. The other interesting thing about domestic violence, I think here with respect to incapacitation is it's hard to solve a shooting. It's not so hard to solve a domestic violence assault if you have a victim who's willing to come forward or you have other evidence. So that could also be another way to kind of solve two serious problems with one stimulus. Are you calling or should I call?
Hi, Anina Johnson from the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission. That was a fantastic paper, thank you very much. I was interested in that precision policing piece that you were talking about. It seems to be very focused on cities and circumstances where there was a high rate of sort of organised crime and organised violence, and that was the real driver of homicides. Is there any comparative work on other cities, or do all cities have big gangs and therefore that's a universal problem, or is there another comparator where homicides are kind of more sporadic and individualised?
Yeah, so this is a great question too. So I've seen research on this in New York, Los Angeles, Barcelona, some cities in South America, usually big cities where there are gangs. Now, the level of organization, though, really does matter, does differ quite a bit. So in South America, the gangs are extraordinarily well organized. They're more like corporations, right? In Chicago or New York or a lot of other US cities, there's actually like just these very loose affiliations. A gang could just be a bunch of kids who grew up on the same block and hang out. Sometimes, like, I could even sort of switch my gang. In fact, gang is not even the right word. I think groups and cliques are actually the words that a lot of group researchers like to use now. So I think, it's unknown how you might apply this approach to places that really don't have any group dynamics going on at all. But I would say that this is an approach that's been applied to people who are not very well organized. So for example, in New York, when we think about some of these gang takedowns, a lot of them really were just interpersonal conflicts. It's literally just insults on social media. It's like West Side Story, but everything is like 1,000 times more rapid because everyone sees it on social media. The insult is not private at all. And so even where it's not like you have this shot caller who's like, okay, yeah, let's get this done. But you have these interpersonal spats. This approach did seem to be effective, at least for 18 months. At some point, things start to tick back up, right? So it's not a root cause thing. It's really just a bandage, but it was a very important bandage for people living in these communities.
From the Director of Public Prosecutions, I'm interested in when you were talking about the Lloyd civil claim against New York and the policy shift. So I'm interested in convictions, obviously, successful convictions. And in that period of time, with the gang takedowns, obviously law changed with constructive murder, and one person can do a shooting and you can cast the net over 10 people and all people can get done for murder. Was that reflected in the research, and did that show in the conviction rate? It's just such a huge shift in policy, and we have those constructive murders now with joint criminal enterprise and other things, but are you seeing that same shift with the conviction rates as well?
So one thing we were not able to get was like individual microdata on who's convicted, but there were a lot of convictions here. So around 70% of people who were swept up were convicted of something. Many others were not convicted, but they ended up spending some time in jail fighting their case. There are abuses that happen in this process. So there's people who like probably aren't even in the gang or the group, but they just know people who are, and they're swept up, and it takes them a long time to prove their innocence, which is why I do consider this to be precision policing, but it's not really a precise form of prosecution. I think the city has gotten better over time at being a little more precise about how these have been prosecuted, but it is not a costless approach. I'm currently working with another city that I can't name right now, that's also doing something like this. Basically, anytime a known target is arrested for something, they get a warrant to search the cell phone, and then they put together the network, and they build out these cases, they impanel these special grand juries to do it. And so I can tell you next year, maybe, if, you know, what's going on there. The nice thing is we're working very closely with the prosecutor's office there, so we're gonna be able to get like every stitch of data available. In the New York paper that I talked about, we had to use a lot of public data.
Hi, Brandy from the Judicial Commission. I was just curious about whether you looked at the militarization of police departments in the U.S. and what impact that has had on crime rates in the last 20 years.
Yeah, there's two conflicting papers about this, and it's hard to parse them. One finds that as police departments get more military equipment from the Department of Defense, police brutality goes up. Another finds that it doesn't. It's a little bit hard to know what to make of that. Here's another perspective on your question, since that part is so unsatisfying. So if you think about whether larger police forces, commit more misconduct. There is some ongoing research right now. So there's a paper that I expect to be out maybe in another 6 months to a year. And I think that paper is finding some evidence that when you have a larger police force, you do get more police shootings. So, which is to say that there are benefits and there are also costs. And every city, I think, has to make up their mind about where they want to be in the continuum, how risk averse are they, and what their perspective is. I'm asked sometimes by journalists, like, what should this particular city do? Should they hire more cops or not? I always say, I have no idea. Like, the voters should decide that. Like, which approach do we want to take? I do think looking backwards, the evidence suggests that there's going to be a public safety trade-off, but there probably are also some things that are costs that will now be avoided. One of them, right, is the widening of the net of the justice system. Another one could be police brutality. I hope it's an area that we'll get more research in. The hard thing about studying these events is even as common as they are, in the United States, they're still rare statistically, and so it's hard to write these papers and get standard errors that are small enough to make really concrete claims.
I think we have time for one more question, if we have someone in the audience. If not, I'm happy to ask a question. So, Aaron, do you think that idea that the net widening at the lower end of the spectrum, is that just necessary collateral damage if you take this approach?
Yes, that's another great question. I would say no. I would say, based on the research that we have that suggests that these high arrest, high stop regimes don't really seem to have impacts on major crimes, at least in the short to medium term, I would say that it is very possible to have a form of policing where you have police officers who are visible, present, not looking to make every arrest they can make, but really prioritizing those arrests and get more of the benefits and fewer of the costs. Sort of like the police visibility in the Indian context, right, where sex assault went down without a lot of arrests being made. So I think it's possible. I'm sure there are places where it's more possible and places where it's less possible. But yeah, no, I'm optimistic.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Join me in thanking Arent for his So we've time for morning tea. I hope the coffee, his situation is okay. You should tell us. If it's not, that's not acceptable. That's not the conference we want to run here. So looking for that feedback.